The Alpha King drops to his knees before his entire court, silver eyes blazing as ancient magic explodes through the palace. The Omega everyone rejected stands at the center, her truth-seeing gift tearing through centuries of lies. One word from her lips could destroy him. Instead, she whispers something that changes everything. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Rain hammered against the palace windows like desperate fingers seeking entry. But inside the Alpha King's study, the only sound was shallow breathing and the crackle of fire that did nothing to warm the chill in the air. Cassian Whitmore stood with his back to the door, broad shoulders tense beneath his white dress shirt. Silver eyes fixed on the storm outside, while his mind replayed a scene that wouldn't stop haunting him. 3 days ago, an Omega had appeared at his gates, and everything he thought he understood about duty and desire had shattered like glass. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Because to understand why the most powerful Alpha in the Northern Territories was standing alone in his study at midnight, wrestling with emotions he'd spent 2 centuries learning to suppress, you need to know about the Omega who showed up in tears. You need to know about Alara. Alara Ashford had always been the kind of Omega who made other wolves uncomfortable, not because she was weak, but because she was too strong in all the wrong ways. She asked questions when she should have stayed silent. She challenged traditions when she should have bowed her head. She felt things too deeply, loved too fiercely, and refused to pretend otherwise even when pretending would have made her life infinitely easier. Her pack, the prestigious Silvercrest family, had tolerated her peculiarities only because her bloodline was impeccable and her beauty undeniable. Pale skin that seemed to glow in moonlight, hair the color of fresh snow that fell in waves past her shoulders, eyes like winter ice that could freeze you with a glance or melt you with warmth, depending on her mood. For 23 years, Alara had played the part expected of her, the dutiful daughter, the perfect Omega, the future mate of whoever her father deemed politically advantageous. She'd smiled when required, stayed quiet when instructed, and buried her true self so deep that sometimes she forgot what it felt like to be real. And then came the rejection, and everything she'd carefully constructed came crashing down in a way that couldn't be hidden or ignored or explained away with polite lies. The Alpha who rejected her wasn't worth naming, but his words echoed in her mind with the kind of clarity that comes from trauma. You're too much, Alara. Too intense, too emotional, too real. I need someone who can play the game, not someone who insists on feeling everything all the time. The rejection had happened in front of 40 witnesses at what was supposed to be their official engagement ceremony. The humiliation had been absolute and deliberate. But what broke Alara wasn't the public spectacle or even the severing of a bond she'd never truly wanted. What broke her was the realization that he was right. She was too much, always had been, and no amount of pretending would ever change that fundamental truth about who she was. So 3 days ago, when the rain started falling and showed no signs of stopping, Alara had done something that nice Omegas from good families never did. She'd packed a single bag, walked out of her father's house without saying goodbye, and started walking north toward the one place she'd heard might accept wolves who didn't fit anywhere else. The Northern Territories, ruled by an Alpha King who'd built his reputation on taking in strays and outcasts, a sanctuary for the broken and rejected. She'd walked for 2 days straight through rain that soaked through her clothes and turned the roads to mud. She'd slept in abandoned barns and eaten nothing but the bread she'd brought from home. She'd cried until she had no tears left, and then she'd cried some more, because apparently even her tears were too much. By the time she reached the palace gates, Alara looked like something the storm had dragged in and forgotten to kill. Hair plastered to her face, dress ruined beyond repair, feet bleeding inside shoes that had never been meant for walking this far. The guards at the gate had taken one look at her and reached for their weapons, probably assuming she was a threat, or a spy, or something equally dangerous. But then she'd looked up at them with those ice-blue eyes, and one of the guards, an older beta named Thomas, had gone pale. "My lady," he'd said, which was ridiculous because she wasn't anyone's lady anymore. "What happened to you?" "Everything," Alara had replied, and that's when she'd started crying again. Not delicate tears that could be dabbed away with a handkerchief, but ugly, broken sobbing that shook her entire body and made her knees buckle. "I need to see the Alpha King. Please, I have nowhere else to go." Thomas had caught her before she hit the ground, and that's when things got complicated, because the moment his hands touched her arms to steady her, alarms had started blaring throughout the palace. Not physical alarms, but something older and more primal. The Alpha King's protection wards, ancient magic woven into the very stones of the palace, responding to a threat against someone the magic recognized as important. Within seconds, guards had poured into the courtyard, weapons drawn, surrounding Thomas and Alara in a defensive formation that suggested they thought he was attacking her. "Stand down," a voice had cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Cold, controlled, carrying an authority that made every wolf present instinctively want to obey. The crowd had parted, and that's when Alara had seen him for the first time. Cassian Whitmore, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, striding through the rain like he couldn't feel it, silver eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with the kind of build that came from centuries of fighting and surviving. White blonde hair tied back from a face that would have been beautiful if not for the scars that marked him as a warrior. 3 parallel lines across his left cheek, a thin white slash through his right eyebrow, and others she could glimpse disappearing beneath his collar. But it was his eyes that held her captive. Silver, like mercury, like moonlight on water, like nothing she'd ever seen before. They swept over her, taking in every detail, the ruined dress, the bleeding feet, the tears still streaming down her face, and something in his expression shifted from cold assessment to something she couldn't quite name. "Let her go, Thomas," he'd said quietly, his gaze never leaving Alara's face. "She's not a threat." "But Your Majesty, the protection wards," Thomas had started to say. "I know," Cassian had interrupted. "I felt them. That's why I'm here." He'd moved closer then, stopping just out of reach, and Alara had the strangest feeling that he was giving her space deliberately. As if he understood that she might bolt if he came too close too fast. "What's your name?" "Alara," she'd managed, her voice hoarse from crying. "Ilara Ashford, of the Silver Crest Pack. I was rejected 3 days ago. I walked here because I heard you take in wolves who don't belong anywhere else. I know I look like a disaster, and I know showing up like this probably breaks about 17 protocols, but I didn't know where else to go. I'm too much for everyone I've ever known, and I thought maybe here, with other misfits, I might be less of a burden." The words had tumbled out in a rush, desperate and raw, and completely without the careful filtering she'd learned over years of playing her part, and the moment they left her mouth, Alara had wanted to take them back, because this was the Alpha King, not some sympathetic friend, and admitting weakness to someone this powerful was the kind of mistake that could get you killed or worse. But Cassian hadn't looked disgusted or annoyed. Instead, his expression had softened in a way that seemed almost painful, like he was feeling something he'd forgotten how to feel and didn't quite know what to do with it. "You're not too much," he'd said quietly, and the certainty in his voice had made something crack open in Alara's chest. "You're exactly enough, but you're also soaking wet and bleeding and on the verge of collapse. Thomas, have someone prepare the blue suite in the East Wing. Send for the healer, and have the kitchen prepare something warm. She needs food and rest before we discuss anything else." "Your Majesty," one of the other guards had protested. Protocol requires that any Omega seeking sanctuary be evaluated by the Council before being granted access to the palace proper. We don't know if she's telling the truth or if this is some kind of trick. Cassian had turned to look at the guard, and even Alara, half delirious with exhaustion, had felt the weight of his displeasure. Do I look like I care about Protocol right now, Marcus? This Omega walked for 2 days in the rain to reach us. She's injured, traumatized, and standing in my courtyard crying because she thinks she's too much of a burden to deserve basic kindness. I'm not making her wait in some holding cell while the Council debates whether she's worthy of help. She's under my personal protection as of this moment. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. The silence that had followed was absolute. No one argued with the Alpha King when he used that tone. No one was stupid enough to try. Cassian had turned back to Alara, and his voice had gentled again. Can you walk, or do you need me to carry you? I can walk, Alara had said automatically, even though her legs were shaking so badly she wasn't sure that was true. But when she'd tried to take a step, her knees had buckled, and suddenly Cassian had been there, catching her before she fell. One arm around her back, the other beneath her knees, lifting her like she weighed nothing at all. I've got you, he'd said against her hair, and the tenderness in those 3 words had undone something in Alara that the rejection and the humiliation and the 2 days of walking hadn't quite managed to break. She'd started crying again, but this time it wasn't the desperate, ugly sobbing from before. It was quieter, deeper, the kind of crying that came from a place of such profound relief that words couldn't touch it. You're safe now, Cassian had murmured as he'd carried her into the palace, his voice so low that only she could hear it. You don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to be anything other than what you are. I promise you. Alara Ashford, whatever you think is too much about yourself, it's not. Not here. Not with me. And that's when Alara had realized something that should have terrified her, but instead felt like coming home. The protection wards hadn't been responding to Thomas touching her. They'd been responding to her presence in the palace, to her proximity to the Alpha King. The magic woven into the very foundations of this place had recognized her as something important, something that needed to be protected at all costs. But that was impossible. She was just a rejected Omega with nowhere else to go. She wasn't anyone special. She wasn't anyone important enough to trigger ancient protective magic. Except apparently, she was. And Cassian knew it. She'd seen the recognition in his eyes when the wards had activated, seen the way his expression had shifted from surprised to something that looked almost like resignation. Like he'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified that it had finally arrived. What's happening? Alara had whispered against his chest as he'd carried her through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. Why did the wards react to me? Cassian had been quiet for a long moment, his footsteps steady and sure even as he navigated stairs and turns without seeming to look where he was going. Then he'd said something that made no sense at all. Because you're my mate. The magic recognized you before I did, before either of us did. But we'll talk about that later, after you've rested and healed. Right now, you need to focus on recovering. Everything else can wait. My mate, Alara had repeated, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. But I was just rejected. I can't be someone's mate. The bond was severed. It doesn't work like that. You were rejected by someone who was never your true mate, Cassian had corrected gently. The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes, Alara. If he could reject you, it's because the bond between you was nothing more than proximity and expectation. But what you and I have, what the magic is responding to, that's real. That's permanent. And that's why you walked 2 days in the rain to find me. Not because you heard I'd taken strays, but because something in you knew exactly where you needed to be. The revelation should have sent Alara into panic, should have made her demand to be put down, to be allowed to leave, to escape before she got tangled up in something even more complicated than what she'd left behind. But she'd been so tired, and Cassian's arms had felt so safe, and for the first time in 3 days, the constant ache in her chest from the rejection had eased just slightly. So instead of protesting, she'd closed her eyes and let herself drift, trusting this stranger who claimed to be her mate in a way she'd never trusted anyone before. When Ilara had woken, it had been to soft sheets and warm blankets, and the kind of comfortable bed that suggested money and power. The blue suite, she'd realized, remembering Cassian's instructions to Thomas. She'd sat up slowly, wincing at the soreness in her muscles, and taken stock of her situation. Someone had changed her out of her ruined dress and into a soft nightgown. Her feet had been bandaged, her hair had been brushed and braided, and there was a tray of food on the table beside the bed. Soup, bread, cheese, fruit, and tea that was still steaming. A note had been propped against the teapot in elegant handwriting. Eat, rest. Don't try to leave. We'll talk when you're ready, not before. You're safe here, Ilara, I promise. It had been signed simply with a C, and Ilara had found herself tracing the letter with one finger, trying to process everything that had happened. The mate bond, the protective wards, the way Cassian had looked at her like she was something precious instead of something broken. She'd eaten because her body demanded it, surprised by how hungry she actually was. The food had been simple, but perfectly prepared, and by the time she'd finished, Ilara had felt almost human again. The healer must have come while she was unconscious, because the deeper aches from her journey had faded to manageable soreness. Her feet no longer hurt when she flexed them. The headache that had been building behind her eyes for days was gone. But the questions remained. How could she be Cassian's mate when she'd just been rejected? How could the bond form with someone she'd never met before today? And most importantly, what did it mean that the palace's ancient protective magic had responded to her presence? Ilara had spent the rest of that first day in her room, trying to make sense of it all. Servants had come and gone, bringing fresh clothes that actually fit, offering to run her a bath, asking if she needed anything. They'd all been unfailingly polite, but Ilara had caught the curiosity in their eyes. The Omega, the Alpha King, carried into the palace himself. The one who'd triggered the protection wards. They didn't know what to make of her any more than she knew what to make of herself. That evening, as the sun had been setting and painting the room in shades of gold and amber, there had been a knock at her door. Ilara had called out permission to enter, half expecting another servant. Instead, Cassian had stepped into the room, and Ilara's breath had caught at the sight of him. He'd changed out of the formal clothes from earlier into something simpler. Dark pants, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked with more scars. His hair was loose now, falling past his shoulders in waves that caught the light. Without the rain and the chaos, Ilara could see him properly for the first time, could appreciate the sharp beauty of his features, the strength in his frame, the way he moved with a predator's grace. But it was his eyes that held her attention, those impossible silver eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense she'd ever built. "How are you feeling?" he'd asked, staying near the door like he was afraid of crowding her. "Better," Ilara had admitted. "The food helped, so did the rest, and the healer did excellent work. My feet don't hurt anymore." "Good," Cassian had said. He'd seemed relieved, though he'd tried to hide it. "I wanted to check on you earlier, but I thought you might need space, time to process everything without me hovering." Ilara had studied him for a long moment, trying to reconcile the powerful Alpha King from the courtyard with this man who was being so careful with her, who was giving her space when he could have demanded answers, who was treating her like she might break if handled too roughly. "You said I'm your mate," she'd said finally, "that the magic recognized me. I need you to explain what that means." Because I was rejected 3 days ago, and now you're telling me I have a new mate bond with someone I've never met. That's not how any of this is supposed to work. Cassian had nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this question. May I sit? The bed seemed too intimate, but there had been a chair near the window. Ilara had gestured toward it, and Cassian had settled into it with the kind of controlled grace that suggested he was always aware of his body, always ready to move, if necessary. What do you know about true mates, he'd asked. Ilara had thought about it. Not much, just that they're rare, that the moon goddess chooses them specifically for each other, that the bond is supposed to be unbreakable once formed. That's accurate, Cassian had agreed. But there's more to it than that. True mates don't just happen by proximity or arrangement. They're chosen because they're perfectly suited to each other, because they have something the other needs, because together they're stronger than they could ever be apart. And the bond doesn't form until both parties are ready, until the timing is right, until all the obstacles that might have prevented them from finding each other have been cleared away. He'd leaned forward slightly, his silver eyes intense on hers. You were matched with an alpha who couldn't see your value, who rejected you because you were too real, too much, too honest. That rejection freed you from a bond that would have slowly destroyed who you are. It cleared the path for you to find me. And I've been waiting for 237 years for my true mate to appear. Waiting for the one person in all of existence who the moon goddess created specifically for me. 237 years, Ilara had repeated, the number staggering. You've been alone all that time? Not alone, Cassian had corrected. I've had my pack, my duties, my responsibilities. But yes, unmated. Waiting for someone who would understand what it means to rule over misfits and outcasts. Someone who would see the broken pieces I've collected and value them instead of judging them. Someone who would be strong enough to stand beside me without losing themselves in the process. And you think that's me? Ilara had asked, skepticism creeping into her voice. A rejected Omega who showed up at your gates in tears? I know it's you, Cassian had said simply. The wards proved it. They only respond to direct threats against me or against my true mate. When Thomas touched you, the magic interpreted it as a potential threat to someone I meant to protect, someone who belongs here, someone who belongs to me, whether you've accepted that yet or not. Ilara had felt her heart racing. This was too much, too fast. 3 days ago, she'd been preparing for a mating ceremony with an alpha who didn't want her. Now she was being told she was destined for a king. I can't, she'd started to say, but Cassian had held up a hand, stopping her. You don't have to decide anything right now, he'd said gently. You don't have to accept the bond or make any commitments. You've been through trauma. You need time to heal, to figure out who you are without someone else's expectations crushing you. All I'm asking is that you stay. Give yourself that time. Give us a chance to know each other. Let me prove that you're not too much, that everything about you that someone else rejected is exactly what I've been waiting for. Why? Ilara had whispered. Why do you care? You don't know me. I could be exactly as difficult and emotional and impossible as he said I was. I hope you are, Cassian had replied, and there had been something almost like longing in his voice. Do you know how exhausting it is to be surrounded by people who only show you what they think you want to see? Who hide their real thoughts and feelings behind layers of protocol and deference? I've built a kingdom of outcasts, Ilara. Wolves who were rejected, abandoned, deemed too broken or wrong to fit in their original packs, and every single one of them came here pretending to be fine, hiding their pain, trying to prove they deserved a second chance. He'd stood then, moving to the window to look out at the darkening sky. But you showed up in tears. You told me you were too much. You didn't try to hide your pain or pretend to be anything other than what you are. A broken Omega who's been hurt and doesn't know if she can trust anyone ever again. Do you know how rare that is? How precious honesty is when you're surrounded by people who lie as easily as breathing? Alara had felt tears building again, but she'd blinked them back. "I'm tired of crying," she'd said. "I feel like that's all I've done for 3 days straight." "Then stop," Cassian had said, turning to face her. "You don't have to cry here. You don't have to be anything here except yourself. Whatever that looks like on any given day. Some days you'll be strong. Some days you'll be broken. Some days you'll be too much. And all of it will be exactly right. Because all of it will be real." The conviction in his voice had made something shift in Alara's chest. Not the mate bond, not yet, but something close to it. The beginning of trust, maybe. Or hope, or just the desperate desire to believe that someone actually meant what they were saying when they claimed she was enough. "Can I ask you something?" she'd said. "Anything. Why haven't you found your mate before now? 237 years is a long time to wait." Cassian had been quiet for a moment, and when he'd spoken, his voice had carried a weight that suggested old pain. "Because I was waiting for someone strong enough to handle what I am. I'm not a kind Alpha Ilara. I'm not gentle or patient or understanding by nature. I've built my reputation on being ruthless with my enemies and protective of my people. I've made decisions that cost lives. I've done things I'm not proud of in the name of keeping my pack safe. And I needed someone who could see all of that, all the darkness and the violence and the cold calculation, and not flinch away." He'd met her eyes then, and Alara had seen the truth of his words in those silver depths. "But I also needed someone who could remind me why I'm fighting in the first place. Someone who feels things deeply enough to balance out my tendency to shut down emotion in favor of logic. Someone who's too much in all the ways I'm not enough. Someone like you." The words had hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and promise and the weight of centuries of waiting. Alara had wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this powerful alpha really saw value in all the things that had gotten her rejected. But she'd been burned before, been told she was wanted only to discover it was conditional. "I need time," she'd said finally. "Time to think, time to heal. Time to figure out if this is real or if I'm just desperate enough to believe anything." "Take all the time you need," Cassian had assured her. "I've waited over 2 centuries. I can wait a bit longer. But Alara, while you're thinking and healing, I want you to do something for me. Stop pretending. Stop trying to be less than you are. Stop hiding the parts of yourself that you think are too much. Because the only way you'll know if this is real is if you let me see all of you, and I do the same for you. No masks, no games, just honesty, even when it's ugly or uncomfortable or revealing. Can you do that?" Alara had thought about it, thought about how exhausting it had been to constantly monitor herself, to suppress her reactions, to be the perfect Omega everyone expected. And then she'd thought about what it might feel like to just exist without that pressure. To be angry when she was angry, sad when she was sad, happy when she was happy, too much when she was too much. It sounded terrifying. It also sounded like freedom. "I can try," she'd said. "That's all I'm asking," Cassian had replied with a small smile. "Now I should let you rest, but before I go, I want you to know something. This palace, these territories, my pack, they're yours now. Not because of the mate bond, not because of some obligation, but because you're here, and that makes you one of us. You can explore anywhere you want, talk to anyone you want, do anything you want. The only rule is that you're safe, you're valued, and you're exactly enough, exactly as you are." He'd moved toward the door then, but Alara had found herself calling out to stop him. "Cassian, wait." He'd turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "Thank you," Alara had said quietly, "for carrying me in, for not making me explain myself to your council. for giving me space, for everything. You don't have to thank me for basic decency, Cassian had said gently, but you're welcome anyway. Sleep well, Elara. I'll see you tomorrow. And then he'd been gone, leaving Elara alone with her thoughts and a feeling in her chest that was equal parts terror and hope. That first night in the palace, Elara had dreamed of silver eyes and gentle hands, and a voice that promised she was enough. She'd woken the next morning feeling more rested than she had in months, and when servants had brought breakfast, she'd actually been hungry, instead of forcing herself to eat out of obligation. The days that had followed had taken on a strange kind of rhythm. Cassian would visit her room each evening, never staying long, never pressuring her for anything, just checking that she was okay and talking with her about small things, books she'd read, places she'd traveled, opinions on pack politics. Nothing heavy, nothing that demanded emotional intimacy. Just conversation that let them learn each other slowly. During the days, Elara had started exploring the palace like Cassian had encouraged. She'd discovered a library that put her fathers to shame, with thousands of books spanning centuries. She'd found gardens that were still beautiful even in autumn, with dedicated gardeners who'd been happy to talk about their work. She'd met pack members who'd introduced themselves with genuine warmth, curious about the Omega their king had carried into the palace but not pushy about it. And slowly, carefully, Elara had started to relax, started to believe that maybe this place really was different, that maybe she really could be herself here without consequence. On the fourth day, she'd been reading in the library when she'd overheard two Omegas talking in the next aisle. "Did you hear?" one had whispered. "The Alpha King's mate is here, the one who triggered the protection wards. My cousin works in the East Wing. She says the king visits her every night." "Lucky her," the other had replied, not with jealousy, but with genuine happiness. "After all this time, he finally found someone. I hope she stays. He deserves to have his mate." Elara had frozen, not wanting to reveal that she was listening. "Do you think she will?" the first Omega had asked. "Stay. I mean, she's been rejected. That has to make trusting another mate bond difficult. If she's smart, she'll give him a chance," the second had said firmly. "The Alpha King isn't like other alphas. He doesn't play games. He doesn't lie. If he says she's his mate, she is. And if she's his mate, she's the luckiest Omega alive. Because being loved by Cassian Whitmore means being protected, valued, and cherished for exactly who you are. I've seen how he is with his pack, how he defends the ones everyone else rejected. Imagine being that important to someone that powerful." The conversation had moved on to other topics, but Elara had sat there thinking about those words, being loved by Cassian Whitmore. She hadn't let herself think about love yet. The mate bond was one thing, but love was something else entirely. Something that had to be earned and chosen, not just given because destiny said so. But what if these Omegas were right? What if Cassian really was as genuine as he seemed? What if he really did value the things about her that everyone else had found too difficult to handle? That evening, when Cassian had come to visit, Elara had decided to test it, to push a little and see what happened. "I'm angry," she'd announced the moment he'd walked through the door. Cassian had paused, one hand still on the door handle. "Okay. At me? At the Alpha who rejected me. At my father for arranging that match in the first place. At myself for going along with it for so long. At the moon goddess for making this whole situation so complicated. I'm just angry, and I know I'm supposed to be grateful that you're being so kind. But right now, all I can feel is rage at how unfair everything has been." The words had tumbled out hot and sharp, and Elara had braced herself for criticism, for being told she was being dramatic or ungrateful or too emotional. Instead, Cassian had closed the door behind him and crossed the room to sit in his usual chair. "Good," he'd said simply. "You should be angry. You were treated poorly. Your father failed to protect you. The Alpha who rejected you was a coward, and the moon goddess's timing could definitely use some work. So be angry. Let yourself feel it instead of pushing it down. Alara had stared at him. You're not going to tell me I'm overreacting? Why would I do that? Cassian had asked, genuinely confused. Your feelings are valid. You have every right to be angry. Do you want to talk about it? Or do you just need someone to sit with you while you process? Alara's eyes had filled with tears, but this time they'd been tears of relief. No one had ever responded to her emotions like this, like they were normal and acceptable instead of something to be managed or suppressed. I don't know, she'd admitted. I've never been allowed to just be angry before. Then let's start there, Cassian had suggested. Be angry. Yell if you want. Cry if you need to. Throw things if it helps. You're not going to scare me away, Alara. You're not going to make me decide you're too much. You're just going to show me more of who you really are, and I'm going to value all of it. And just like that, something in Alara had broken open. All the rage and hurt and frustration she'd been carrying for years had come pouring out in a torrent of words and tears. She'd railed against every unfairness, every dismissal, every time she'd been told to be less. And through it all, Cassian had sat quietly, listening without judgment, offering tissues when needed, and steady presence, always. When she'd finally exhausted herself, when the anger had burned itself out and left her hollow and aching, Cassian had spoken. Feel better? Surprisingly, yes, Alara had admitted. That's good. Cassian had stood, moving toward the door. Now get some rest. Tomorrow, if you're up for it, I thought we could have breakfast together. Maybe start establishing a routine that's less formal than these evening visits. Alara had nodded, too emotionally drained to do much more. But as Cassian had reached the door, she'd called out one more time, "Why are you being so patient with me?" "Because you're worth it," Cassian had said simply. "And because I've learned that the most valuable things in life can't be rushed. You'll trust me when you're ready, Alara. Not because I demand it, but because I've proven I deserve it. That's how this works." Now, 3 days later, Cassian stood in his study at midnight, replaying that conversation and every other moment he'd spent with Alara. The mate bond was there, humming beneath his skin, growing stronger every day they were near each other. But he'd meant what he said. He wouldn't rush her, wouldn't pressure her, would give her all the time she needed to heal and decide if this was what she wanted, even if it killed him to wait. Even if every instinct he had screamed at him to claim her, mark her, make sure everyone knew she was his. Because Alara deserved better than that, deserved to be courted and valued and given a choice. Deserved to know that her mate saw her as a partner, not a possession. And Cassian had waited 237 years. He could wait a little longer for the woman who'd walked through a storm to find him, even if she hadn't known that's what she was doing. The woman who was too much in all the ways that made her perfect. The woman who was, even now, sleeping in the East Wing, surrounded by protective magic that recognized her as something precious worth guarding. His mate, his queen, his salvation, if she chose to be. And Cassian would spend however long it took proving that she should. But what he didn't know yet, what Alara was only beginning to realize as she lay awake in her own bed, thinking about silver eyes and gentle patience, was that the choice had already been made. The moment he'd caught her when she fell. The moment he'd promised she was enough. The moment he'd sat with her anger and called it valid instead of too much. She'd been choosing him in small ways every day since she arrived, and soon, very soon, she'd be ready to make that choice official. But first, there were things they both needed to understand about why the mate bond had formed now, and not earlier. Things about Alara's bloodline that she didn't know yet. Things about Cassian's past that he'd been hiding, because the moon goddess's timing wasn't random, and the protective wards hadn't responded to just any Omega. They'd responded to the one Omega in all the territories, who carried a power that Cassian desperately needed, a power that would change everything about how he ruled and who he could protect. And that revelation was coming soon. Whether either of them was ready for it or not, the revelation came on the 7th morning of Ilara's stay. Though not in any way she could have anticipated, she'd agreed to have breakfast with Cassian in the small dining room adjacent to his study, a space that felt more intimate than the formal great hall where the pack usually gathered. The room was warm and inviting, with windows that overlooked the northern mountains and a fireplace that crackled pleasantly. Cassian was already there when she arrived, dressed casually in dark pants and a simple shirt, his white blonde hair loose around his shoulders. He'd smiled when he saw her, and Ilara had felt that now familiar flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with destiny and everything to do with the man himself. "Good morning," he'd said, pulling out a chair for her. "I hope you're hungry. The kitchen has prepared enough food to feed a small army. They get excited when I actually eat breakfast instead of just having coffee in my study." "That's because you work too much," Ilara had said, settling into the chair and trying not to notice how close Cassian was as he pushed it in. "When was the last time you actually took a day off?" Cassian had paused, thinking about it. 1793, he'd said finally, completely serious. There was a particularly brutal winter, and the entire territory was snowed in for 2 weeks. I couldn't work even if I wanted to. Ilara had laughed, the sound surprising her. "That's not exactly recent. Maybe you should consider another break soon." "Maybe I will," Cassian had agreed, moving to his own seat across from her, "especially if I have someone to spend that time with." The words had hung between them, heavy with implication, and Ilara had felt her cheeks warm. But before she could respond, the door had opened, and an older woman had entered, carrying a tray laden with food. She was tall and elegant despite her age, with silver hair pulled into an intricate braid, and eyes that were the same unusual silver as Cassian's. An alpha, Ilara had realized immediately, and a powerful one at that. "Aunt Meridian," Cassian had said, standing quickly. "I didn't expect to see you this morning." The older woman had set down the tray with a raised eyebrow. "Clearly. Otherwise you would have warned me that you'd finally found your mate instead of letting me hear about it from the kitchen staff." She turned to Ilara then, and her expression had softened. "You must be Ilara Ashford. I'm Meridian Whitmore, Cassian's aunt and the keeper of our family's history. It's a pleasure to meet you, my dear." Ilara had stood as well, instinctively offering a respectful bow. "The pleasure is mine, Lady Meridian." But Meridian had waved away the formality. "None of that. If you're going to be family, we might as well skip the stuffy protocols." Besides, she'd added with a pointed look at Cassian, "I'm here on business this morning, not a social call. Business that concerns both of you." Cassian's expression had shifted to something more serious. "What kind of business?" "The kind that explains why the protection wards responded to Miss Ashford with such intensity," Meridian had said, settling into a chair and gesturing for them both to sit as well. "The kind that explains why the mate bond formed when it did, after you'd waited so long. The kind that involves secrets your family has been keeping for generations, Ilara, whether you knew about them or not." Ilara had felt her heart start to race. "What are you talking about? My family doesn't have any secrets. We're just ordinary wolves from an ordinary pack." Meridian had pulled out a leather-bound book from the bag she'd brought with her, old and worn with pages that looked centuries old. "This is the Whitmore family genealogy," she'd explained. "Every bloodline of significance in the Northern Territories is documented here, along with any special gifts or abilities that run in those lines. Your family's name appears in this book, Ilara, and the notation beside it is one I haven't seen in over 300 years. She'd opened the book to a marked page and turned it so Ilara could see. There, in faded ink, was her family name. Ashford. and beside it, in script so old it was barely legible, was a single word: Truth-seer. Alara had stared at the page, not understanding. What does that mean? It means, Cassian had said quietly, his silver eyes intense on her face, that you carry a gift that's been dormant in your bloodline for generations. The ability to see through lies, to know truth from deception, to sense the genuine intentions behind words and actions. It's an incredibly rare ability, Alara, and it's exactly what I've needed for centuries. Alara's mind had been reeling. That's not possible. I don't have any special abilities. I'm just an Omega who feels things too deeply. That's the ability manifesting, Meridian had explained gently. Truth-seers don't just see lies, they feel truth. Emotional truth. The genuine feelings beneath surface actions. It's why you've always been so uncomfortable in your pack, Alara. You could sense the insincerity, the political games, the false pleasantries. You knew instinctively when people were lying or hiding their real intentions, even if you didn't consciously recognize what you were sensing. Alara had thought about her life in the Silver Crest pack, about how she'd always felt like she was drowning in dishonesty, about how conversations had always felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate, about how she'd known deep down that her intended mate didn't truly want her even before he'd said the words of rejection. Oh, goddess, she'd whispered, it's been there all along, and I never understood what I was feeling. The gift usually awakens fully when a truth-seer finds their true mate, Meridian had continued. Someone whose intentions are pure enough, whose honesty is complete enough to trigger the final manifestation of the ability. Someone like Cassian, who's built his entire rule on protecting outcasts, and who values genuine connection above political advantage. The mate bond formed now because you were finally ready to recognize truth when you saw it, and because Cassian needed you. Alara had looked at Cassian, seeing him with new understanding. That's why you've been so patient with me. Why you've never once tried to hide what you're feeling or thinking. You knew I could sense deception. Not at first, Cassian had admitted. When you arrived, I just knew you were my mate. The protection wards confirmed it. But once I started researching your bloodline, once Aunt Meridian found this entry, I understood why the bond had formed. And yes, I've been scrupulously honest with you because I knew that anything less would feel wrong to you, would trigger that sense of unease you've been living with your whole life. He'd reached across the table, offering his hand palm up. But Alara, I want you to understand something. I'm not being honest because your gift demands it. I'm being honest because you deserve honesty. Because after 237 years of political maneuvering and careful words and strategic half-truths, I'm so tired of pretending. I want to be real with someone. I want to be real with you. Alara had placed her hand in his, and the moment they touched, something had clicked into place. The truth-seeing gift Meridian had described, awakening fully for the first time. And what Alara had felt from Cassian through that connection had stolen her breath. Absolute truth. Complete sincerity, bone-deep loneliness that he'd been carrying for centuries, and desperate hope that she might be the one to finally ease it. Love, already forming, already taking root, already growing into something that would define the rest of his immortal life. She'd gasped at the intensity of it, at feeling his emotions as clearly as her own, and Cassian had squeezed her hand gently. Now you understand, he'd said softly. Now you can feel what I've been trying to tell you with words. You're not too much, Alara. You're exactly what I need, exactly what I've been waiting for. And everything I've said, everything I've promised, it's all true. You can feel that now, can't you? Yes, Alara had whispered, tears streaming down her face. I can feel it. I can feel all of it. And it's overwhelming. I know, Cassian had said, his thumb stroking across her knuckles, but we'll figure it out together. You'll learn to control the gift, to shield yourself when you need to use it consciously instead of being battered by everyone's emotions. Aunt Meridian can teach you. She's worked with truth seers before. Meridian had nodded. It will take time, but you'll master it. And once you do, you'll understand what an asset you are. Not just to Cassian, but to the entire pack. Do you know how many disputes could be settled easily with a truth seer present? How much manipulation and deception could be prevented? You're not just the Alpha King's mate, Alara. You're going to be essential to how this pack functions. The weight of that realization had settled over Alara. She'd spent her whole life being told she was too much, too emotional, too intense. And now she was being told that those very qualities made her valuable, that the ability to feel deeply and sense truth was a gift, not a curse. It had been almost too much to process. "I need," she'd started to say, but the words had caught in her throat. "Time," Cassian had finished for her, understanding immediately. "You need time to adjust to this. That's fine. We have all the time you need. But Alara, while you're processing, I want you to use your gift on me. Feel what I'm feeling. Know that every word I've said to you has been true. Know that when I tell you I've been waiting for you, when I tell you that you're perfect exactly as you are, when I tell you that I'm already falling in love with you, it's all completely, undeniably real." Alara had closed her eyes, letting herself fully feel the connection between them. And what she'd sensed had been so pure, so genuine, so free of any deception or hidden agenda that it had broken through the last of her defenses. This was real. The mate bond was real. Cassian's feelings were real. And for the first time in her life, Alara had allowed herself to believe that maybe she really was exactly enough. Over the following weeks, Alara had worked with Meridian to master her truth-seeing abilities. She'd learned to create mental shields that protected her from being overwhelmed by everyone's emotions. She'd learned to consciously activate the gift when needed and turn it off when she wanted privacy. She'd learned the difference between surface feelings and deep truth, between temporary emotions and lasting intentions. And through it all, Cassian had been there, patient and supportive and unfailingly honest. They'd fallen into a routine that felt natural and right. Breakfast together every morning, where they'd talk about everything and nothing. Afternoons where Alara would train with Meridian or explore the palace while Cassian handled his duties as Alpha King. Evenings where they'd have dinner together and then talk late into the night, learning each other's histories and hopes and fears. And slowly, carefully, the space between them had begun to close. It had started with small touches. Cassian's hand at the small of her back as they walked through the palace. Alara's fingers brushing his as she passed him something at dinner. Sitting close enough on the couch in his study that their shoulders touched. Each touch had sent sparks through the mate bond, building heat and connection and anticipation. But Cassian had never pushed for more. Had never demanded physical intimacy or assumed his rights as her mate. He'd simply been present, honest, patient, until the night Alara had decided she was done waiting. It had been 3 weeks since the revelation about her truth-seeing gift. 3 weeks of learning to trust Cassian completely. 3 weeks of feeling his genuine care and respect and growing love through the bond that connected them. 3 weeks of falling in love with a man who saw her intensity as strength rather than weakness. And Alara had woken that morning knowing with absolute certainty that she was ready to accept the mate bond fully. She'd found Cassian in his study that evening, working through reports by firelight. He'd looked up when she entered, his expression warming. "Alara, I wasn't expecting you tonight. I thought you were having dinner with some of the other Omegas." "I was," Alara had said, closing the door behind her and leaning against it. "But I left early. There's something I need to tell you, something I need you to know." Cassian had set down his papers immediately, giving her his full attention. "What is it? Are you all right?" I'm more than all right, Alara had said, moving toward him. I'm ready. Ready to accept the mate bond. Ready to be yours. Ready to stop pretending that I'm not already completely in love with you. Cassian had gone very still, his silver eyes intense on her face. Alara, are you certain? You don't have to rush this just because I've been waiting centuries. We can take as much time as you need. I've taken enough time, Alara had said firmly. 3 weeks of feeling your emotions through the truth-seeing bond. 3 weeks of sensing your absolute honesty and genuine care. 3 weeks of learning what it means to be loved by someone who values every part of me, even the parts I thought were too much. I'm certain, Cassian. I choose you. I choose us. I choose this. The emotion that had flooded through the mate bond at her words had been overwhelming. Relief and joy and love so intense, it had made Alara's knees weak. Cassian had been there immediately, crossing the distance between them and pulling her into his arms. Say it again, he'd demanded, his voice rough with emotion. Say you choose me. I choose you, Alara had repeated, looking up into those silver eyes that had become her entire world. Cassian Whitmore, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. I choose you as my mate, not because destiny demands it, but because I want this. Because I love you. Because being with you feels like coming home to a place I never knew I was missing. Cassian had kissed her then, and it had been nothing like the gentle, careful touches they'd shared before. This kiss had been claiming and desperate and full of centuries of loneliness finally ending. The mate bond had flared between them like a star going nova, and Alara had felt it snap into place with finality. Permanent, unbreakable, perfect. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Cassian had rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he'd said fiercely. More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. You walked into my life in tears and chaos, and you've given me everything I didn't know I needed. Honesty, connection. Someone who sees me as Cassian instead of just the Alpha King. I'm going to spend the rest of our lives making sure you never regret choosing me. I could never regret this, Alara had assured him. You've shown me what it means to be valued for exactly who I am. You've taken everything that everyone else called too much and treated it as treasure. How could I regret finding someone who loves the real me? The official mating ceremony had been held 2 weeks later, on the first day of winter when the full moon hung bright and heavy in the sky. Wolves from across the Northern Territories had gathered to witness their Alpha King finally claim his mate, and the celebration had been unlike anything Alara had ever experienced. There had been music and dancing and food enough to feed hundreds. There had been speeches from pack members who'd come to love their unexpected queen, sharing stories of how she'd helped settle disputes with her truth-seeing gift, how she'd brought warmth and genuine care to a court that had been cold for too long. Meridian had presided over the ceremony itself, binding Cassian and Alara's hands together with a silver cord while speaking the ancient words that made their union official. But it had been Cassian's vow that had made Alara cry. I, Cassian Whitmore, take you, Alara Ashford, as my mate and my queen. I vow to honor your gift and cherish your heart. I vow to never ask you to be less than you are, to never dismiss your emotions as too much, to never make you pretend for the sake of politics or propriety. I vow to love you in your strength and your vulnerability, in your joy and your anger, in every moment of every day, for the rest of my immortal life. You are my salvation, Alara, my truth, my home, and I will spend eternity proving that you made the right choice when you chose me. Alara's own vow had been simpler but no less heartfelt. I, Alara Ashford, take you, Cassian Whitmore, as my mate and my king. I vow to stand beside you in leading this pack of outcasts and misfits. I vow to use my gift to protect the truth and expose deception. I vow to love you honestly and completely, to never hide who I am, to always be real with you. You taught me that being too much was actually being exactly enough. You showed me that my intensity was strength, not weakness. And I will spend the rest of my life being the partner you deserve, the queen this pack needs, and the mate you waited centuries to find. When Cassian had marked her, claiming her before the entire pack, the bond between them had blazed with such intensity that every wolf present had felt it. A connection so strong it resonated through the very stones of the palace, through the protective wards that had recognized Alara from the first moment she'd arrived. The magic itself seemed to celebrate their union, sending waves of warmth and light through the territory. The celebration had lasted long into the night, but eventually Cassian and Alara had slipped away to the private chambers they now shared, and there, away from the crowds and the ceremony and the politics, they'd simply held each other. Two souls who'd found their perfect match. An alpha king who'd waited centuries for honesty. An omega who'd spent her life being told she was too much. Together, finally, completely, eternally. You know, Alara had said as they'd watched the moon through their bedroom window, her back against Cassian's chest and his arms wrapped around her. If you'd told me a month ago that I'd end up as a queen, mated to the most powerful alpha in the territories, I would have thought you were insane. If you'd told me a month ago that a rejected omega would walk through my gates in tears and become the most important person in my life, Cassian had replied, kissing the top of her head, I would have called you a liar. But here we are. Here we are, Alara had agreed, lacing her fingers through his. And for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Exactly with who I'm supposed to be with. Exactly who I was always meant to become. As am I, Cassian had murmured against her hair. As am I. In the months that followed, Alara had transformed the Northern Territories in ways no one had anticipated. Her truth-seeing gift had become essential to pack governance, helping settle disputes that might have escalated into violence, exposing wolves who were lying or manipulating others, ensuring that justice was based on truth rather than whoever had the most political power. But more than that, her genuine warmth and emotional honesty had changed the culture of the pack itself. Wolves who'd been hiding their pain started opening up. Omegas who'd been dismissed as too emotional found themselves valued for their empathy. The entire territory had become a place where honesty was rewarded and pretense was gently discouraged. And it had all started with one omega who'd been brave enough to show up in tears and admit she was broken. 6 months after the mating ceremony, Alara had been in the Great Hall settling a dispute between two betas when a familiar scent had made her freeze. She'd turned slowly, hardly believing what her senses were telling her. And there, standing at the entrance to the hall, had been her father, Lord Ashford of the Silvercrest pack, looking older and smaller than she remembered, his expression a mixture of shame and hope. Father, Alara had said, her voice carefully neutral. What are you doing here? I came to see you, he'd replied, moving closer with hesitant steps, to apologize for failing you, to tell you that I was wrong about everything. The beta who'd rejected you, he's been exposed as having massive gambling debts. He was only interested in your dowry, not in you, and I pushed you toward him anyway because it was politically advantageous. I'm so sorry, Alara. You deserved better from me. Alara had activated her truth-seeing gift, feeling for deception, but there had been none, just genuine remorse and a desperate desire to make amends. You're telling the truth, she'd said quietly. You really do regret what happened. I do, her father had confirmed, and I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I should have seen then. You were never too much, Alara. You were extraordinary, and I was too blind to recognize it. Cassian had appeared at Alara's side then, his presence both protective and supportive. Lord Ashford, he'd said formally, Your daughter has built a life here. She's valued, respected, and loved. If you've come to try to take her back, you'll find that impossible." "I haven't come to take her anywhere," Alara's father had said quickly, bowing respectfully to Cassian. "I've come to witness what she's become, and to offer my support if she'll accept it. I've heard stories about the truth-seeing queen of the Northern Territories, about how she's changed pack politics across the region. I'm proud of her, even if I have no right to claim that pride." Alara had felt tears building. For years she'd wanted her father's approval, had tried so hard to be what he needed her to be, and now that she had it, now that he could finally see her value, she realized she didn't need it anymore. She'd found her worth in Cassian's eyes, in her pack's respect, in her own understanding of who she was. Her father's approval was just a nice addition, not the validation she'd once desperately craved. "Thank you," she'd said finally, "for coming, for apologizing, for seeing me. I appreciate it more than you know. But Father, I need you to understand something. I'm not the Omega who left Silvercrest in tears. I'm not the broken, rejected wolf who thought she had nowhere to go. I'm Queen Alara Whitmore, truth-seeing mate to the Alpha King, and I've found exactly where I belong." "I can see that," her father had said softly, "and I'm glad, truly glad. You deserve this happiness, even if I couldn't give it to you." Alara had smiled then, genuine and warm. "Would you like to stay for dinner? I think it's time you met my new family properly." Her father's expression had brightened with hope. "I would like that very much." That evening, as Alara had sat at the head table with Cassian on one side and her father on the other, surrounded by pack members who'd become family, she'd felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. This was what home felt like, not the absence of pain, but the presence of genuine connection, not pretending to be less, but being celebrated for being exactly who she was. Later, after her father had left with promises to visit again, after the pack members had drifted off to their own homes, Alara and Cassian had found themselves back in their private chambers. Cassian had pulled her close, and Alara had melted into his embrace. "Tired?" he'd asked against her hair. "Exhausted," Alara had admitted, "but in a good way. Seeing my father, having him finally acknowledge what happened, it gave me closure I didn't know I needed." "I'm glad," Cassian had said, "though I have to admit part of me wanted to throw him out for how he treated you." "Only part of you?" Alara had teased. "I thought for sure your protective alpha instincts would be screaming at you to defend my honor." "They were," Cassian had confirmed with a slight smile. "But I also know you're perfectly capable of handling your own battles, and I trust your judgment. If you wanted him gone, he would have been gone. But you chose mercy. That's one of the many reasons I love you." Alara had looked up at him, studying the face that had become so dear to her. "Do you ever regret it, waiting so long for your mate? Do you ever wish you'd settled for someone else instead of spending centuries alone?" "Never," Cassian had said firmly, "because settling would have meant spending those centuries with someone who couldn't truly understand me, someone who couldn't feel the truth of my emotions or appreciate my honesty, someone who would have required me to pretend, to play political games, to be the Alpha King instead of just Cassian. Waiting for you was worth every lonely year, because being with you is worth everything." The sincerity of his words, confirmed by both his emotions through their bond and Alara's truth-seeing gift, had made her heart swell. "I love you," she'd said simply, "more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. Thank you for teaching me that being too much was actually being exactly right. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked through me. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for showing up in tears," Cassian had replied, pulling her closer. "Thank you for being brave enough to walk away from a pack that didn't value you. Thank you for giving me a chance. Thank you for choosing me when you could have chosen safety or solitude or anything else." You've given me everything I didn't know I needed, Alara, and I'm going to spend the rest of our lives making sure you never doubt that you made the right choice." Years passed, and the legend of the truth-seeing queen who'd arrived at the palace in tears became one of the most beloved stories in the Northern Territories. Young Omegas who felt too emotional, too intense, too much, would hear about Alara and find hope. Wolves who'd been rejected or cast out would come to the palace seeking sanctuary, knowing that the queen herself understood their pain, and Alara would greet each one with the same words Cassian had spoken to her that first night. "You're not too much. You're exactly enough. And you don't have to pretend here. You don't have to be anything other than what you are. Welcome home." The pack had grown under their rule, becoming the largest and most diverse in all the territories. Wolves from everywhere came seeking a place where honesty was valued over politics, where gifts were celebrated instead of suppressed, where being different meant being treasured rather than cast out. And at the center of it all were Cassian and Alara, the Alpha King who'd waited centuries for truth, and the Omega who'd shown up in tears and given him everything he'd been missing. On their 10th anniversary, as they stood together watching the full moon rise over their territory, Alara had found herself reflecting on everything that had changed. 10 years ago, I was a rejected Omega, with nowhere to go, she'd said quietly. I thought my life was over. I thought being too much meant being worthless. And now look at us. Look at what we've built. Cassian had wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "You were never worthless. You just needed someone who could recognize your value, someone who'd been waiting long enough to know treasure when he saw it." "Someone like you," Alara had agreed, lacing her fingers through his. "Someone exactly like you." They'd stood there in comfortable silence, two halves of a whole, perfectly matched despite all the ways they were different. Cassian with his centuries of loneliness and carefully controlled emotions. Alara with her gift for feeling too deeply and seeing truth others missed. Together they'd created something neither could have built alone. A kingdom where outcasts became family. A rule based on honesty instead of manipulation. A love that proved destiny wasn't just about fate, but about two souls choosing each other every single day. And in the distance, beyond the palace walls, beyond the territory borders, beyond everything they could see, other rejected Omegas were gathering their courage. Other wolves who'd been told they were too much were starting to believe they might be exactly enough. Other broken souls were beginning to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a place where they could belong, where they could be real, where they could stop pretending, because that's what Alara and Cassian had given the Northern Territories. Not just leadership, or justice, or protection, but permission. Permission to be honest about pain, permission to feel deeply without shame, permission to be too much and have that be exactly right. And it had all started with one Omega who'd shown up in tears, refusing to pretend anymore, and one Alpha who'd looked at her and said the words she'd needed to hear her entire life. "You don't have to pretend with me. You're exactly enough. Welcome home." The rejected Omega had found her king. The Alpha who'd waited centuries had found his truth. And together they'd built a kingdom where everyone could finally stop pretending and just be real, where being too much was celebrated, where honesty was treasured, where love was based on seeing and accepting every part of someone, not just the parts that were convenient or easy or politically advantageous. That was the legacy of Alara and Cassian Whitmore. Not conquest or wealth or power, but transformation. The transformation that happens when someone finally sees you, really sees you, and loves what they find. When someone tells you that you don't have to pretend, and actually means it. When someone waits centuries for you, even though they didn't know your name or face, because they knew in their soul that you were worth waiting for. And in the end, that was the greatest truth of all. The one that Alara's gift confirmed every single day, every single moment, in every beat of the mate bond that connected her to Cassian. Love, real love, the kind that lasts forever, doesn't ask you to be less. It celebrates you for being exactly who you are. Too much, too emotional, too real, too everything. Because to the right person, to your true mate, your perfect match, you're not too much at all. You're exactly, precisely, perfectly enough.